Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You have new hair.
I have
How are you doing?
freshly washed hair. It's not in a ponytail.
Maybe that's it. Not in the
Yeah,
ponytail.
I usually
got
tie it back
a
because I don't
deck
like
and a wooden front porch.
Well, my hair's
As long as-
getting long enough
as long
that
as like this, doing fussing with her hair. And in a hearing, I don't like to do that, so I pull it back. But I did wash it and I wanted to
do something.
impress everyone with how clean it was.
getting to the point where I have to tie my hair back when I'm shaving.
Oh, boy, yeah.
Might
Are
have to get a
you,
I
haircut.
have some
and look like
ideas for.
Are you growing it out?
Probably like a handy
Maybe?
type or.
Mostly because I'm too lazy to go find
yeah,
a.
that's my thing too. I had it cut right before I went to New Orleans for my
But I want
niece's
somebody to
wedding.
mess it up. with.
And had it trimmed. And that was, it's probably once a year, maybe.
Just in terms of who's
How are you doing?
available. and-
Yeah,
Good.
Hanging in there.
it's so hard to get.
What's your hat? CPI?
I have no idea what this is.
Chairman?
I found it at a trailhead. And it was there when I started the hike. and It was still there when I finished the hike. So I said,
Yours now?
It confiscated it.
There's no holiday in between.
and I actually, I tried to Google it and I couldn't even find it.
Right,
No idea what.
right?
Maybe just clicking there.
I probably stands for industries.
Yeah, and what does it say on the back? Colorado
Hmm.
owned and operated. So it's a local something.
Yeah, so the
Whatever.
C could stand for Colorado. So what's the P stand? I don't
I
know.
don't know, Private eye,
That's something else.
Oh, you know what? You should
I
also
don't
do
know,
that.
and I don't know
Colorado
if,
private
private
eye.
eye, that's you, yeah. Looks suspicious,
Yeah.
like,
Yep,
looks,
just
yeah,
click in the box.
looks like you're after someone. How's Kipper doing?
Rocco, that guy's a little
Kipper
shit.
is-
yeah,
Oh, today?
he's gonna be a long shot. but-
All right.
So they just,
Had to be,
Had
had
to
to
be.
be, right? I know Sally's
Yeah, I
probably
didn't
taking
even
it pretty hard.
oh,
Tom wants to know if you have a new phone yet.
This guy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, do you have a new number? Is it the same
changes
number?
Same number.
Because he said he texted you, and he didn't hear, but it was probably because of Kipper.
It's his problem. He has that, I was getting texts
Right there.
from, well, I shouldn't say it was his problem.
Well, I'm gonna go home
Thinking
and
the
tell
rounds.
where's?
the gift said it's your
Well,
problem.
no, because, for the most part, I was getting
I read that's my policy. Kids said it so.
text on my, they come through on the iPad.
Right?
What was really weird is none of the political crap texts came through. So, after I went to the Verizon store, got the thing hooked up, it was like I had 30 or
Mike gave me
40
one.
texts. Bing, 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 bing,
You
bing.
needed,
It may
like,
have
oh,
just
you
gotten
need like
lost
frame,
in
like your frame?
It's gotta
I'll
go
tell
through
him
the,
to
it's
try
gotta go
again.
through the wood floor.
And if you don't
through
get
the
it, it's his,
trailer,
it's his problem.
Right.
And the like.
He
leaf
wants to
springs
set up
are in
a
the way, so I
joint
can't go
call
up.
with you and Will and BJ on the
I could
Utah
move it,
trip.
but I don't want to.
So a conference thing. I
And
don't know
then
how
Rocco
he
had
thinks
these
he's
like
gonna do that,
extension
but
bits, but the
BJ probably knows
adapter for the bit is like
call.
Yeah,
half inch.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's like 2 weeks away, you guys are going.
her to
2 weeks.
so-
Order
them.
You ever heard of the White Rim Trail,
There's always
Dan?
something.
Over
Which
in
one?
Utah,
There's always
the White Rim
something, so-
Trail?
They're doing it?
Yeah, in their trucks.
Oh.
How we doing?
Trucks.
How are you? Good. Not a big fan.
Hell, the gang's pretty much all here.
Nice. All sugar, no chocolate. Lots of figuring things out.
Are you from the East Coast originally, Giff?
yeah.
I thought I heard like a Boston accent.
I got a
New
cute
New Hampshire.
backyard.
Hampshire. New England, Nick Hampshire.
Yeah.
Massachusetts. I
Right.
did live, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I lived in New Hampshire
Yeah, I'm so
for
tapped.
35 years.
Like Boston suburb, New Hampshire, down south, or right there
Dark, like I'd never really.
hinterlands?
For a while, Boston suburb, right on the border. And then we.
Yeah,
went
when it's
up
Yeah,
to-
I was just like, this is gonna be, this
Nice.
would be great.
What else to do with it?
This week.
Oh, where the University of New Hampshire is where? So we got Keene.
No, well, there's a Keene State College, there's a Plymouth State College,
I mean, it takes
the
me.
University of Durham.
It's anytime
Kids are going
food,
down with that.
just like pizza.
Care about baseball? Am I supposed to commiserate about the Red Sox with you?
Sure. Hey, but they certainly hurt the Twins. So they may have.
Came with a light, but we didn't.
You guys ready?
Yep, we're good.
Broadcast
Okay.
is now starting.
right.
All attendees
go.
are in listen-only mode.
Go ahead. Start it up. Work session this evening.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you all. We have a number of items actually to go over this evening, and we'll we'll start off with the item that Catherine's put together in regards to inclusionary housing and ADUs, amongst other things. And then we will move into a discussion about some of the hot topics that have come up around the new land use code and try to get a little bit of your feedback on some of these items. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Catherine on the first item.
All right, good evening. So the first discussion is about what it might look like if we were to allow a minor subdivision to deed restrict an ADU to meet their inclusionary housing requirement. So the way that we came at this is through the lens of our inclusionary housing ordinance and how can, kind of maybe this square peg fit into that round hole and what needs to be done to make that work. So currently, our current compliance for a minor subdivision, so anything 5 lots or fewer, would be they could opt to build and deed restrict a home, just like a larger subdivision could, or they pay the fee in lieu per all of the buildings that they put up. So thinking about this option of could they do an ADU instead of another primary unit? So if we look at the pros and cons of that, or what opportunities it presents, the benefit is you actually get a built unit where you usually would not get a built unit. And those are pretty much always preferred over fee payments. But as we dug into it, there are a number of challenges with it. So looking through the lens that it still needs to meet kind of what the intent and the purpose of our inclusionary housing ordinance, there's a couple of challenges that this presents. So the first one is the timing of providing that ADU. And this goes to both if somebody's going to build it and it's going to count for this whole, say 3, 4, 5 lot subdivision, then we have to ensure that we have that unit being built. So that whomever's going to build it, presumably, would need to build it with their primary. So it would be somebody who would need to be able to finance the building of both of those. And we've had people come before us before where that's been a struggle. There was the minor subdivision, or the multiple principal structures in River Ridge, I believe, where the whole reason they couldn't comply is they couldn't get the financing to do, we had required the multiple unit structures because it was such a large lot. So that is a real issue, I think probably one of the most significant issues. Then we have some administrative issues of ensuring the ADU gets built when we can't actually issue a CO for an ADU before a primary unit. So we'd have to kind of figure out some timing. Maybe there's a workaround with that. It's not ideal, but it does present some of these challenges that might not at first be the issue. And if the ADU is not first and it's, the third of a 5-unit subdivision where somehow that's the lot that's gonna do it, things go awry, doesn't happen, well, if you've already CO'd these other units, like there's really no way to claw back the fee in lieu, which would then be the fallback. So the second topic is the conflicts with the inclusionary housing ordinance and kind of what its purpose is. So by definition, an inclusionary housing ordinance means that you're you're making these units the same or similar and in the same locations as the market rate units. So they're not this lesser than type of unit, and they're not the unit over there. So it's that lesser than that is something that, okay, it might be all homeowners, you know, the 5 lots, but this is by nature has to be a rental if it's an ADU. So, and then looking for the parity, it will then by nature always, it would be something that's smaller. It's size restricted, you know, much, maybe you could get a 2-bedroom in some ADUs, but typically it's, you know, small and not necessarily works as well for a family unit. So in that case, so if we wanted to move forward with this, what we've offered here are some things, some requirements for that deed restricted ADU, just to ensure it is a little bit more on par with the home. Still meets ADU requirements and size limits, but also has some other boundaries as far as minimum size, or that it has at least a bedroom and has functionally equivalent appliances as the main unit, that it is not just the smallest possible studio outfitted with virtually nothing. So, so then the third item, the third challenge would just be the administrative challenges to ensure compliance with the deed restriction. And these are, I would say they are things that can be worked through. They're still challenging, and it's still administrative time, you know, that we would have to work through with the housing authority. Not like deal breaker items, but just the acknowledgement that there is that extra layer of administrative challenges to go through. This is probably where, so you may or may not have heard about other programs in Colorado where they have deed restricted ADUs. I can think of probably about 5, and I did look into some of those. And here's some those examples probably offer the most insight in this particular area as far as administering. But what I want to do is set what I found, because when we first posed, you know, this idea, I was like, oh, great, I'll just look at all these other programs and it should be easy to put something together. But the biggest difference, the thing that divides what we are trying to do and what all those other programs are trying to do is none of those other programs are doing it as this is how you meet this inclusionary housing requirement, right? Like you're required to, you know, do this fee in lieu or build this unit. Here's an alternate way to meet that. Like they're not doing it to meet a broader inclusionary housing requirement that's in their codes. The second thing that is quite often the case is these are, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. These are in several of those areas where you can do it, you are not allowed to just build an ADU. The only way you can build an ADU is if you deed restrict it, right? So one of the cool things about Salida, and one of the things I noticed as soon as I moved here, before I even worked here, was we have what I would consider like one of the most progressive ADU policies in the state, if not the country, right? All I see in every forum is, we should be allowing ADUs, and here's how, you know, here's what this jurisdiction did and how they do it, and they still have more requirements than us. And then they hold up this jurisdiction, wherever, and they still have more requirements. Like, it's awesome that we have this on the books and people are building ADUs. But in those other jurisdictions where it's the only way they can get an ADU. So they already have a primary homeowner, and the only way they can get it is to deed restrict it. So it's just a whole different dynamic of how you get to it and the kinds of maybe rules you can put on it and what people are willing to do and how the structure of it would be. There's not that issue of how do we claw back a fee in lieu if you don't, and those types of things. So those are the, I guess, the opportunities and challenges that I found for for doing an ADU as a allowed deed restriction. And if we want to discuss that, if you had a chance to go through the staff report, you can see that it kind of just raised this other idea that I then go into, but I can talk about that now, or we can talk about just the ADU part. I don't know what you guys prefer.
Are you just speaking to the workforce?
Yeah.
I'd say you could go into that and then we can,
Okay.
yeah.
So it was something that came up when we were putting together all these ideas and kind of weighing the ADUs was, what if it wasn't an ADU, but it was a primary unit, but the deed restriction for a minor subdivision was not the full income and workforce deed restriction where we set out the AMI, but rather it was just a workforce-only deed restriction. So that theoretically, the developer, if somebody had, a 4 or 5 unit subdivision and built or deed restricted one of the lots, the price that they could sell it for is not set by how we do it now, where you're like, okay, you're at this AMI and this many bedrooms, that's your price, max price. It is, the person has to meet these workforce requirements, and whatever a qualified person can afford and wants to pay for this unit, that's what it sells for. So it's the thought being that the builder of it might be able to recapture a little bit more of their investment than if it had both the income and the workforce requirement tied to it. With that, it would be on parity as required by the inclusionary housing ordinance. And the administration and enforcement would be much less onerous than the ADU, and then even, slightly less work and administration than the current deed restriction that we do. So you still have the challenges of the timing of it. Like, when is it going to be provided? Because once again, if it's committed to, but it doesn't happen, and units 1 and 2 have already been sold, what do you do if you didn't have that fee in lieu? And then even if, one of the things that we do now is we'll collect a deposit on the fee in lieu. So if a builder is like, they're building, say, 6 units and one of them has to be deed restricted, we'll collect a deposit of the fee in lieu from these first 5 that the builder, like a singular builder's doing. And then when they CO that inclusionary housing unit, they get that deposit back. Mm-hmm. And that's, if they fold up or, things just go awry and they never build that inclusionary housing unit, we've at least captured those deposits along the way. But in a minor subdivision where we find, some of the ones that have come forward recently, it's not a builder building these 4 or 5 houses. They're selling the lots and the owner, then builds their own house. So if this restricted unit isn't first and we're collecting these deposits from all these random people and they're all waiting for this neighbor to finish, before they can, and we've got $20,000 of their money. Like, that's not really a situation I think that we want to put people in with their neighbors. So the second thing, when it comes to primary, for deed restrictions just for workforce only, is also community buy-in. And that's just a matter of understanding and where our community is at. Because one of the things you can hear about, if you dig into it, when you're looking at places like Summit County or whatnot, where they have these types of restrictions and other very expensive communities, you'll hear prices that some of these units are either being rented for or selling for, and they might sound insane. You're like, oh my gosh, that's a deed restricted unit. It's a $4,000 one-bedroom rental, and that's, a deed restricted unit for just workforce. But what you need to step back and think of is, if the deed restriction is kept in force, it's going to just naturally float where it floats, the price that they can get based on the community. So you can't, you have to be willing to let that happen wherever that is. Salida's not there. Nobody's going to rent the $4,000 one-bedroom deed restricted unit because there's plenty or enough at market, that's nowhere near where the market is. But it's just kind of something to keep in mind with these types of deed restrictions that the community needs to understand and buy into, that the rate is going to set, presumably below market. There would be no reason to purchase something with a restriction if it was the same price as market. But if that market level goes crazy, the workforce is going to go up, but it's still restricted. It still has there'll still be that gap. So those are the thoughts.
I have a
that we had.
question, Mr. Chairman. Can I
Sure.
step in and ask a question? Catherine, I understand all of what you're saying. First of all, I just want to say that I really like the way this is being presented to us. It's very thorough, pros and cons, gives us a chance to really think about all these things. On the issue of, the timing of the restricted unit, you were talking about, even if it's market rate, don't we have that same problem now with the deed restricted income unit? Isn't it kind of the same thing? We're just taking the income off of it? It's the same thing.
Yes, but so far, what we've had is a single developer, so they're building the units. And that's one aspect to it. The other is that there's, let's just say it's a 40-lot subdivision. So we will, at some point, we can stop issuing COs until they get that
I'm not sure I
unit.
was clear. So I'm talking about with the minor subdivisions. Point A, build a deed restricted for income and workforce. That's one of their options now.
Yeah.
So if the only thing we were removing was the income restriction, we'd have the same issue with provision and timing and all of that we have now.
Oh, so that's true. I see what you mean.
See what I'm saying?
Yes.
So that, to me, that doesn't really, if we were to choose that option, it's no different
Yes.
than what we're doing now. We're
True.
just doing it a little easier without the income restriction. If that makes sense?
Yes. The only example in a minor subdivision where somebody has chosen to build it is, I believe, the condos just down First Street. And they were all listed for sale by the same owner. Like, that person.
But my point is, we already have this on the books. So if we were to decide this is what we wanted to do, I always go back to what's the problem we're trying to
Yeah.
solve? And to me, we're trying to do something to help the minors, what did I call it? the standalone minor subdivision, not something that's 5 units, part of a different development, but just a standalone minor subdivision, 5 units or less, whether it's a developer or an individual, trying to help get more built units rather than just, collecting fees in lieu,
Yeah.
which, as we've heard
So-
from others, has been thought to be rather onerous. So,
So with that, then maybe it's not that big of a deal, like, because if we did that today with 5 different owners, but they were actually building the unit, we would collect that fee in lieu deposit and then
Right.
return it. So that could very well not really be an issue.
I think
It
that's
was-
the key is the deposit, because without the deposit,
Right.
there's no way to
no, you gotta have the
ensure.
deposit, but
Yeah.
that's what we're
Get
doing
anything.
now,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
So
We
going-
haven't had to apply it in that situation,
Right.
but you are correct, it's out there and would be applied.
so let me just ask another question, if the board will allow me. So going back to the ADU discussion, I understand all of what's been put out here. And I understand the issue of having to do it subordinate to the primary unit. But if you had a situation where you had one, let's say it's not one developer. Let's say it's somebody selling lots, and they have one person that says, yes, I want to do this ADU and deed restrict it. Would you collect a deposit, a larger deposit from them to hold their feet to the fire, rather than trying to claw it back from individual people? If they're the ones making the decision to build it and deed restrict it, is there some kind of, I hate to call it a penalty, but is there a way to make sure that does get done? The other question is, does the ADU have to be financed with the primary structure? When we did that split primary lot that you referred to before, we had that discussion about it doesn't need to be financed together. Do you remember that, Greg?
Vaguely, yeah.
It was at River Ridge, I guess, and it was a lot that had been drawn together, and they were wanting to split it because they couldn't finance them together, and we turned it down because the conversation was they didn't have to be financed together, and we didn't think they should have to split the lot and then unsplit it when they financed the other thing. Do you remember that one?
I do.
Yeah, so I guess my point is, if it doesn't have to be financed together, is that an objection? And
But if it's not financed together,
can you finance the ADU first? That would be.
yeah, but you can't then you'd have to change the rules about, and maybe we could, but you would have to change the rule that currently says you can't get a CO on an ADU before you get a CO on a primary residence.
Is that a county rule,
No, that's a city rule.
a city rule?
Yeah, because it's accessory to what? Accessory to the primary.
Right.
I would just interject on the financing. I mean, people finance things in all kinds of different ways. So I almost would think that as long as the rules are straightforward, that's something maybe out of the scope of the program. People will be able to finance them, either with the primary or through fund. I mean, there's a lot of different ways. And so, I don't know. I think it's an important consideration, but it's also maybe, in my opinion, would be best left up to the owner to decide how.
Well, I think it's just,
It's
just based on timing, right? We're not really caring how it's financed
Right.
or not. It's just a matter of whether they can get it.
Ensuring that is getting done.
in terms of CO, you mean like,
Like if they can build the house and the ADU, and I think that's kind of up to them, and then maybe there is a time frame to it, like as far as CO to CO. If you CO the primary, you have a year to CO the ADU,
Again, I mean, that'd be dependent on probably holding on to the deposits and, who you're taking that deposit from. You take
So
it from
you're saying you'd be holding deposits from the other landowners as well?
That's how we-
and that person, that whoever's just said, I will do it, like whoever volunteers or says, I will, that you're holding deposits from other,
We currently do it
Yeah.
based on whoever builds the market rate units, right? So if it's the developer building the market rate units, then we take it from the developer on each of those units prior to CO. If it's going to be, lots for sale and different people building them, then we would take it from each of them prior to them getting CO, unless the developer were to front all that money. We do have the newest calculation actually allows for sort of a typical house size, so you then come up with a typical fee in lieu.
yeah, so like if you don't have plans, like the fee, the deposit is based on the fee itself, correct?
Correct. And the size,
And then the fee is based on the size of the house.
right.
So if you don't have plans, but like if you buy the lot and development starts, you're like, that's what you're saying, you're still gonna collect a deposit from that owner.
Again,
But
unless
you
the
don't know how
developer,
much. Yeah.
unless the developer fronted all that fee, for everybody else, which,
Which is tough.
good luck.
Yeah.
I don't
Looking
see
at
that.
this from a builder's standpoint, have you done calculations which show it would be in the builder's interest to do this as opposed to pay the fee in lieu? I'm just trying, I mean, let's say we put this regulation in place, is it gonna get any use?
We don't know.
I would venture to say yes, and here's why. Not because currently, it's, in my opinion, adding an ADU from a builder's perspective, let's say a true developer that wants to build 4 or 5 units and sell some of them, you very often kind of break even on the ADU, so there's not a lot of incentive to add a unit. There's more incentive to pay the fee in lieu. Initially, when you brought this up, I was kind of like, I kind of had that thought, like, where is the real incentive here? But if you knew that you could capture a little bit of that incentive and contribute it towards a built unit, I do think you would see more builders say, let's build 5 units, let's add an ADU to one of them.
So many
You know-
people build the ADU anyway.
Well, then there's that, which I think is also, that goes back to the very like, we have a great ADU policy.
Right.
But, I don't know, so
And I would say that might be, that is true. We're having a lot more development coming in where they're building the ADU on the lot at the same time, which may be an argument against allowing this to count as the IH unit, because if the ADUs are being built anyways, and right now, ADUs tend to be rented probably, lower than market, if you will, than say a primary unit. And there's a sort of natural affordability already built in. If we're throwing away the fees in lieu because folks are going to build an ADU and deed restrict that, we're kind of banking on the idea that the prices for ADUs are going to go up, right? That they are, the only real advantage is if the ADU prices go up considerably over time. If they don't, if they stay the same, more or less as they are now, then what are you actually getting out of it? You're losing the fees in lieu in exchange for a deed restricted ADU, which you might have had the ADU anyways.
Right. It only makes sense if it adds an ADU, to me. Yeah, I mean, I do like the idea of encouraging more built units, encouraging more small built units. That was kind of what started this whole thing in my mind is, I mean, we all agree that the fees in lieu that are being paid aren't really getting us forward. They're not moving us in the direction. We can't use that money and build something. But if somebody's building and we can encourage, a deed restricted ADU and they were to build that, somehow that seemed to make sense to me. I don't know. I'm kind of agree with Kenny. I think it's an incentive.
But I think the problem that I see is that it's only gonna happen with an individual. Like, if you own the lot and you agree, like, okay, I will do that, a builder's not gonna be able to sell that. No, they're not gonna be able to build a home with an ADU and then sell it like, oh, by the way, your ADU is deed restricted. Nobody's gonna buy that. I mean, very few, unless there's an incentive to buy it, unless it's way cheaper. Then they're gonna wanna buy an ADU, a home with an ADU that they can use as an office or put their mother-in-law in, or, you know what I mean?
It's part of their affordability calculation, and could you have the fee come back to that landowner as a credit?
Yeah.
Have the fee up front, and then I'll do it, I'll sign up, I'll build it. or it's
Unless
built,
there's an
and then I'll
incentive
take the
to,
credit.
yeah, for it to be a
And then I can
benefit to
afford
them, they're not gonna just buy a place with a deed restricted unit, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Because how is that inclusionary fee being used now? It's matching big projects, or you're doling it out to close rent gaps, or
At this-
convince people to deed restrict?
At this point, it's being amassed for the larger projects, specifically First and D, future senior low-income housing project plan on the east side of town, and South Arc neighborhood, sort of assisting with getting that going. The hope is that once those are taken care of and financed, that, you know, there may be some other larger projects that come up, but the hope is to establish more of a policy to provide incentives, perhaps, to developers in various ways. That policy needs to be established. So,
Can someone remind me, what are the restrictions for workforce housing?
It's an average of 30 hours a week, averaged across a year. So if it's seasonal, it doesn't have to be on a weekly basis, but on an annual basis, the number of hours that equals 30 hours per week, at a business doing its primary business in Chaffee County.
So a lawyer making $1 million would be able to buy one of these units.
If they were working in Chaffee County and it was
Yeah.
a workforce only. But if that lawyer making $1 million can afford a unit without a deed restriction, you know,
Might want, yeah.
it would.
And what happens if you do all your due diligence to try and rent it or sell it to somebody in workforce, and you just can't find them, and then you can find anybody if you've done the?
So no, or, I mean, that, granted, that piece could be worked out, but the intention is no, you just keep lowering the price till you find somebody, whether that be rent or for sale, till it's enough of an incentive that you have people.
yeah, like in South Arc, right, we've got those 25% units that are for workforce, non-income. Believe that we built into it that they have to market them to local folks for minimum 9 months before it goes out to the general
Then they can go to the general public.
MLS.
And not including like remote work and that sort of thing. They have to be physically
Correct,
working
yeah,
somewhere
back to
here
the
in town or in the
requirements.
county, right?
Yep.
And that in South Arc, though, those are on top of 50% of it
Right.
is already deed restricted at the various AMI. So that's just, you know, a
Right.
little icing on the cake.
Right.
Whereas this is the cake.
Yeah. You know, after reading all, I think I mentioned to Carolyn earlier that, the problem of trying to get more built units as opposed to a fee in lieu, and the onerous financing on the individual minor subdivisions. I want to be really careful, though, that this wouldn't go out to fractional things everywhere else. Like, that a development that would have 4 extra, credits still has to,
Yeah, you're talking minor subdivisions.
minor
only.
subdivisions only, in standalone minor subdivisions only is how I'm thinking of it in my mind.
Wasn't a minor subdivision all the way up to 19 units?
Nope.
5
It's
or less.
less than 6. So, yeah,
I realize.
for,
So I don't
5 or
have any
fewer.
problem taking away the income requirement for those minor subdivisions for a primary built unit. Because again, the point is, if we can't, I still like the idea of the ADU. I'm not necessarily done with that. But if we can't find some way to do that, making having that be non-income restricted, I think would prevent people from, or would incentivize people in that situation from paying the fee in lieu and deed restricting one primary unit without the income requirement for workforce. And that would be a permanent deed restriction. So,
Just the workforce part is permanent?
yeah, so if they opted for that, they can still pay the fee in lieu, and nobody's taking that away if that's what they want to do. But I would love to see, a deed restricted ADU as one of the options, if it's feasible. But I also think that if we have somebody that's building, say they have 4 lots, right? And they're going to build or sell 4 lots, or they're going to build on the 4 lots. If it's so onerous to have the income restriction that they can't get someone to buy the lot and build the house, would they be able then to get that sale done if there were no income restrictions and it was just a workforce deed restriction? And in that way, allowing us to have another built unit that's deed restricted somehow, but not with the income requirement, because I think that's what jams people up on these small ones, as we've seen in this room recently.
Say something, Goof.
Please.
Yeah, and just to clarify too, I think it's assumed that just as we did with South Arc, it's a reoccurring deed restriction, right? So
Yes.
the first time it gets sold, it has to be sold to somebody within the workforce. That household decides to sell that same unit, it has to go to somebody else in the
Right.
workforce.
Right, and by
right?
your description, the price would probably organically be a little bit less because they have the deed restriction. Maybe not a lot less and no income requirements, but if it is in fact harder to sell with it, and Kenny, you're in the market right
Catherine
now.
said it could still be shocking.
Right,
I
right,
just have something from the broadcast chat
yeah,
reminding everyone to speak clearly into their
Oh, clearly into
microphones.
the
That
microphones.
people are having trouble hearing.
Thank you.
Yep.
So, while we're thinking about all of these various things, I also mentioned that I would like to talk about duplex conversions and how they might, duplex conversions don't come before us as a minor subdivision, if I'm correct at that. Is that correct?
Correct.
So they're kind of an outlier, and yet they're still required to have the same fees that a minor subdivision does. And I'm not sure that we should be treating them the same. I think if somebody's got 1 lot and they can build a single-family home, but they voluntarily decide to build a duplex and split that, should they have to pay the same kind of fees in lieu that a minor subdivision has with 5 or less lots? I don't know. That's something that kind of bothers me a little bit, because in a sense, we're penalizing someone for creating
De-incentivized.
2
Doing that.
instead of 1 in that specific situation. And I'm not talking about a development that decides to be duplexes. I'm talking about 1 lot, somebody owns it, they're building a house, they're going to build a duplex, convert it after it's built or before it's built. So that's my other topic.
We talked about this a fair amount this morning, and kind of went round and round on some stuff. It's, from our perspective, it's a bit of a slippery slope, right? Because if you have 1 lot that you could divide in 2 and put a duplex on, and you're not going to require any sort of fee in lieu there, then what's the justification for doing the exact same thing if it was a triplex? Right? And the reality, at least in Salida, is to an extent, duplexes and triplexes, townhomes in general, don't automatically equate to affordability, right? So a single-family home, 1,500 square feet on a lot, may cost $750,000. A duplex on its own lot may cost $650,000 to $700,000 still. It's not exactly quote-unquote affordable to the local workforce. And that's what the fee in lieu is supposed to sort of try to help balance out. And just one point of clarification, the duplexes are treated differently than, say, a 5-lot subdivision by nature of the fee in lieu proration, right? So the fee for 5 lots is going to be different than the fee for 2 lots.
So what if we were, because if we decide, let's say on option 2, to say there's no income requirement and we want to have a built unit, primary unit, but we're doing that for a minor subdivision, which would not apply to a duplex conversion, because duplex conversion is not a minor subdivision. So what would happen if we applied that to duplexes as well? So you got one side of the duplex has to be for community and you don't have to pay the fee in lieu. I'm not sure I would want to do that without an income requirement, though. I don't know. That is a slippery slope. I'm just throwing the stuff out at you guys.
Could you review, what are the duplex conversion fees? I'm uncertain on what they are.
So right now, for instance, the full fee in lieu, 100% fee in lieu, which is technically not really something that we use because it's sort of a base number, and then you have this proration. It's $13.59 per square foot, right? The latest fee schedule changes created this proration. Council had asked for this proration so that the units, if it is just a duplex conversion, they're not having to pay the same amount if it's 5 units or 5 lots. So it steps down from that $13.59 all the way down to $6.80 per square foot for one single unit within a development being created or one new lot. So you're basically having it. So a duplex conversion, if you're creating 2 new lots or 2 new units, pays, what was the number, $8?
$8.15 a square foot.
$8.15 a square foot. And then it goes up to like 9 something for 3 units, 10 something for 4, 12 for 5. So
Why does it increase as the unit count increases?
Because so the thought was there are more market rate units by which to recapture the cost for, say, the developer or the subdivider. That it is the reason for the stair step.
So what if we were to allow, honestly, just making this stuff up. So what if we were to allow a duplex conversion to take advantage of the ADU as a deed restricted unit? Because it's typically one person building it and then converting.
Say that again?
yeah,
We were to allow the duplex conversion to take advantage of a deed restricted rental ADU to offset the fees in lieu, because it's typically one person building it and then dividing it, right?
so you're saying in addition to duplex, like each on their own lot,
Right? One of them has an ADU.
one of them has an ADU,
Yeah,
you're saying?
one of them would have an ADU. That ADU would be rented, deed restricted, income required. And so we've created a unit in exchange for the fee in lieu. It's one owner, which is, I understand the onerous part when you have all these multiple owners and things. It might not work for the minor subdivision, as we've heard, but would it work then as an option for a duplex conversion? The thought.
Picking that up briefly, do we actually know essentially if deed restricted ADUs work? Like, I'm unclear. Like, I know there's lots of ADUs around. I think most of the ones I know, I think, are market rate. And I don't think we can force someone to rent an ADU. They could keep it empty for all we care.
It's,
We could if it was part of their exchange
Part of the
for
agreement,
the
yeah.
agreement for the
Yeah.
fee in lieu.
In these programs, so it's in the administration of it that I think we can learn from some of the other communities. And there's a few different examples, but it's something where we would work with CHA, the Chafee Housing Authority, on examples are requiring every year, like they monitor that it is rented. CHA would actually do the qualification of the potential renter, making sure they met the income requirements, which in our current code would be maxed out at 80% AMI for both setting the rent and the renter's income. And so there's different ways and different practices that we can learn from other communities, but that's how you do it. It's required to be rented, and it's monitored by Chafee Housing Authority that it's rented to both a qualified applicant and that it is in fact rented.
And so if the issue then is reselling it, which I know we've heard, what if something like that had a sunset? You know, it happened for 10 years, and after that, the deed restriction goes away. They've paid their fee in lieu in terms of renting to the deed restriction. And if they were to sell it before that, then they would have to pay the fee in lieu.
And I guess the question for that is, for you all to consider, is balancing, the current inclusionary housing ordinance is pretty forcefully says it needs to be permanent. So how do you feel if you set aside this other one that's not permanent to meet that?
How many developments of 5, I mean, what are we, I guess the way I should ask the question is, if this were in force and everybody decided I'm gonna do it via an ADU, how many deed restricted ADUs would we have created in the last 5 years?
5 years, I don't know, but I think in the past 1 year, it would be 4 or 5.
And that's,
Assuming that they,
If they all, like the minor subs
right.
yeah.
and stuff, I would say 4 or 5.
I mean, I don't know. I think we're chasing ghosts here. I just don't think it's gonna make a whole lot of difference in the amount of
think-
housing that gets built.
I think the purpose isn't necessarily to create, of course, we want the units, but it's also in an effort that we've made to like alleviate the pressure for
Right.
that small,
Right,
the developer that's doing
Right.
that small lot. and
or the
it's-
duplex, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And, if it
And if
needs
you
to
can
be.
get a unit, if you can get a deed restricted
Right.
ADU, if we can work a way that
Right.
it works, I think it's probably
I think it's
worth
feasible.
figuring something out.
Could we just quickly go back, Francie, you had mentioned the possibility of a workforce unit as one of the duplex units. How do folks feel about that versus the ADU option with the duplex?
I mean, personally, I think the ADU makes more sense because it's easier. I mean, it's deed restricted. It would be, if you go to the other side of the duplex and it's just for community, you really haven't gained much. You've still got the unit. It's not deed restricted. If it was deed restricted, that would be okay with me for the duplex.
When you say deed restricted, you mean by income
Income
or?
restricted, yeah. I mean, that's why I kind of like with the duplex situation, that's kind of why I favor the ADU because, you've got 2 market rate properties. They might both have ADUs. Somebody's living on one side of it. They decide they can deed restrict their ADU in perpetuity or sunset or however we have to make it work out. I know that it's more difficult. It's perceived to be more difficult to sell, but I also think that there's a buyer for every situation. Kenny, you know how that is. And I think if somebody were to go ahead and sell something like that, there are buyers that would come into this market and sell it. There are a lot of buyers that come into this market and pay cash for things. They don't have to finance it. I mean, I don't think we should get so hung up in, the future, what happens if something doesn't work out. But I am committed to trying to, personally, to try to figure out what Greg said. How can we help the small developer individuals and all of that doing the minor subdivisions, and also create more built units versus fees in lieu, because we're not developers, we're not building anything. We do have money to leverage, but the little things that are coming in from these small projects aren't really going to get us there. But a built unit would get us there faster.
Can we go, unless you want to keep going on this, that's fine, and around, but what I wanted to just look at quick was the requirements. Do you guys have opinions on that? The individual requirements that you had in there, like yeah.
For what part, Greg?
Like the interior staircase only, minimum one bedroom. I guess I'm not really sure on a few of them.
Okay,
You just kind of pull those from somewhere, like other.
so where, some of these came directly from requirements that other communities have just on their IH units in general. So one thing that we have not gotten to yet, which I think is a good thing, is communities that have had deed restricted properties for a long time have found that over time, some developers will figure out how to build the most minimal thing possible. And so what those communities have done, they have, if you read through these, they have like the amount of square footage of countertops that have to be in the unit, right? Because you don't have to, I mean, there's a lot in the building code that's not required. So that they actually have to have kitchen cabinets becomes a thing. They have minimum sizes of sinks. So that it doesn't get whittled down to nothing. So that, we don't face that, and that's fabulous. Hopefully we never do, but we've got examples out there to follow if we see it. So some of these things just came from looking at, okay, what are some of these communities requiring when that's the case? And what are things that would make the ADU just a little bit more, have a little bit more parity with a single family detached home or half of a duplex, however that is, just to have more of that all around parity. And it's not like all the market rates are, these 3,000 single family detached and then, oh, there's your inclusionary housing component. And so that's where these are just, so it's a combination of those, and they're just like things that I thought of on top of, like what is it that would make it more on par? So do with the, discuss what you want, or for example, the one bedroom, would you want these ADUs just to be, a 300 square foot studio? And is that considered parity with if there's 5 single family detached? So,
The only two that I really wouldn't care about would be the interior staircases, because especially if we're talking about a duplex, I don't really think that's that big of a deal to have the staircase outside. Maybe Greg and you guys will have a different take on that. And also windows on all sides, I'd hate to legislate that because it may not be practical, But I do like the idea of at least a one bedroom and a minimum and maximum size. And the appliances and the preserved outdoor space, I don't know, that we're seeing an elimination of that fast, so I don't know.
Are we enforcing those rules now?
So those are.
The LIHTC units the same as the rest of the stuff in Confluence Park? I suspect not. And I could give you some other examples. I mean, I think that we either need to take that out of the ordinance, or we got to start enforcing it, because I don't think we're making much of an effort to enforce that. I may be wrong, but.
I agree with you with the interior staircases. I think that like the amount of space that a staircase takes can be quite a bit, obviously. Like if you have a 10-foot ceiling in a garage, like, and then the ADU is above, then you need, 17 risers to get up there, and that takes a lot of space. So I've built them. I've built a few ADUs with exterior staircases, and I just don't see the problem with that. I'm okay with the one bedroom. Or minimum size. I agree with you, windows on all sides kind of dictates,
We've tried that before.
like, I just don't see why that one would be
Practical.
pertinent. Yeah, there may be a spot that you don't want a window on the side, or you have your mechanicals on that side, or whatever it is. And then,
You could rephrase that, couldn't you? Like windows and living space, like you can have those.
so you could have a window to floor ratio, or, but even that gets kind of, yeah.
When we were doing, what ordinance was it that we were discussing when we talked about windows and talked about viewscapes and, how high the window should be and that? And we finally concluded, and this is years ago, finally concluded that it wasn't something we
just
could
really tough,
control,
yeah.
because every situation is
That was
different.
the setback of ADUs from the lot line.
Right.
And how that varies based on the height of the ADU.
And then appliances, kitchens, I don't know, I mean, you could have the house with nicer stuff and, and then HVAC that are functionally equivalent. Well, as long as it's heating, it's functionally equivalent.
And yes, and that one comes to, so with the appliances, and that, I took that wording straight out of another ordinance, or,
Right.
requirement, like I was saying, and the functionally equivalent component, which
Right.
it goes into. So for example, if the main house has a washer dryer, then you have a washer. It doesn't have to be the exact same or same size, but you have to have the washer
Right.
dryer.
Yeah, so I'm okay with those two
and-
exceptions.
And then the one thing on the HVAC would be if there's AC, if you have some sort of cooling mechanism in the main house, then you provide a cooling component in the ADU.
I would totally disagree with that.
Yeah, I'd be, to me, it's like, you just can't put a hot plate. I mean, I'm a different standard, but like, I do think I get the intent of it, and I
Well-
think it'd be okay to be like,
Because I can design an ADU, maybe the house needs cooling. I can design an ADU that doesn't need cooling.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of,
I can say.
only until recently
Yes,
did
but not
did
everyone's
people.
you, right? Like I get the intent here is to make it equivalent.
Well,
right?
then your HVAC would be functionally equivalent.
Yes, a natural, yeah.
And so many people are using those mini splits now that have both heat and air, and that's a pretty
course.
easy solution
Yeah.
for something like this.
And there are details behind this, so a hot plate wouldn't be a functional equivalent to a stair.
But that's where I see
But-
where I see the need for this. Like, you got to have a stove,
Right,
and
you
a
gotta have a,
sink, and
Right.
like
maybe a
di-
dishwasher.
Well, not
yeah.
even a dishwasher. Like,
Right.
there's plenty of ADUs where you.
Yeah.
The building code also already, as far as I know, the building, like, if you're gonna have an accessory dwelling unit, I believe you have to have a stove. Is that, like, you have to, the building code already dictates a
Right.
lot of this stuff, so that's where I'm kind of,
Right,
I would be willing to defer to on that.
right.
But saying like it has to be the same, like,
Yeah.
Not
like
the
someone has a
same,
$10,000 range,
Right,
does that
the-
mean
not the same-
ADU has to
Yeah,
have?
and that's the
No.
point, is
Only
that
if
it
it's got an air
doesn't have to be
fryer.
the same.
right,
If you're
Um,
fresh.
And
right.
it goes into many examples as to what would be considered functionally equivalent, understanding that the primary home's probably going to be bigger and fancier and more bells and whistles.
So what do you
Yeah, you
guys,
have to have hot water and you have to
Right.
have heat, you have to have.
so what would you guys think about going to a non-income primary on the minor subdivisions and allowing ADUs on the duplex conversions? Income required on the ADU, non-income required market rate on the deed restriction on the minor subdivisions, so that we can, maybe encourage no fee in lieu on that and have a built unit that's for the community, but that these smaller duplexes would have the option of having a deed restricted ADU in one side.
I like it. I mean, I think
Yeah, like I said, I don't know, like with GIF, I don't know how many we'd get, but it
but why not?
doesn't matter.
They can still
I don't
pay
think it's
it.
gonna become a way out of some,
No.
of something,
It's
yeah,
another option.
yeah.
And it doesn't hurt, I mean, the timing situation, we're doing it now, so it's no different. It's just that we're not putting the income on it. And the ADU would be, and I remember when we first started this, she said that they were getting, in Summit County, I think, affidavits every year. Like the Housing Trust.
Yep.
So I would probably be the one doing that, but, so it's doable. I would personally love to see staff come back with something like this. I don't know if anybody else feels that that's good direction.
I think it's worth continuing to look into it.
Okay.
Could I ask a question about, you said the housing authority is the one that checks to see that people are doing what they're supposed to do about deed restricted units? Do they have people that go out and do that, or how do they, I mean, that sounds like a
They will if they
hard
get their
thing
money.
to do. They've got to find these units and find out what people are doing. How does that work?
Well, they're a multi-jurisdictional housing authority. So technically BV, Salida, and the county oversee the housing authority.
Yeah.
So technically, those jurisdictions kind of set the priorities, goals, and everything else, directly or indirectly. They have a board. But that is their primary objective, is to administer programs that we put in for affordability. So that would be expected of them to do. But of course, it all comes down to capacity and related funding.
Yeah.
If, to
Is
Francis'
that
point,
working?
if the ballot measure goes through this year, makes it a little bit more feasible for them to take one-off kind of programs like this or concepts like this.
Well, and Bill,
It makes it more challenging.
yeah, and there's 2 ballot initiatives. So either one could pass or fail. The one is to debruce so that they can keep the money and not have to give it back because of Tabor. And the other one is the sales tax. So even if the sales tax were to fail, which I personally hope it doesn't, even though it's a lot of, the debrucing measure is really probably the most important, because I was told that they have money to like do Jane's Place and stuff, but they can't use it because they're under this, Tabor restrictions. So that one really has to pass. The other one hopefully will, and they'll get money to do these things.
So how is it working so far? I mean, we have deed
So-
restricted units.
Yeah.
Is it working, or
Yeah,
are
so the
people
housing-
selling them, or what?
So the Housing Authority is the contact for anyone interested in buying a deed restricted unit.
Okay.
They go to the Housing Authority.
So they go
And
to
they
the housing
collect-
authority, not the builder or the realtor or whatever.
Or with the realtor directs them to the Housing Authority, if that's the case. And then the Housing Authority they have the applications, looking at their income and their assets and everything, where their work is. So they go through that now. And then we're in constant communication. They constantly, or not constantly, but when we're in the middle of qualifying people, they reach out with questions to me or to us, and we work with them with that process.
I just wondered, it seemed like
So I don't know when we're ready to move on, but I want to make a personal aside if I could because I know Greg's involved with this group too, the Chafee Housing Trust. I went this afternoon and walked through their West End unit, and hats off. It looks great. Very well done. They had a little tent out there, and they've already, I guess, got commitments on 2 of them. So I just encourage everybody that's involved in this to walk through and see. Because, I mean, they had upgraded countertops in those. They didn't have Formica. I don't know what it was, I didn't ask. But, I mean, it was really well done. And Claudia has just done such a good job of promoting that and getting people qualified. It takes such a long time. But anyway, these things are happening. And for people out there who may not think that anything's going on, it is. It's slow but sure. And they looked really nice. I was impressed, Greg. So.
Third and M is almost there too.
Yeah, that's what Reed said, that they'll be doing I want to tour them too.
Phew.
Getting there.
I echo that. We went as well just before this meeting and they look really good.
They look
And
good, yeah.
they're 6 deed-restricted units that probably wouldn't have been built otherwise,
Right.
you know.
Yay, town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just so everyone's aware, Home and Court provided 2 deed-restricted
Yes.
units. One sold a while back.
Yeah.
The other one, they ended up renting it for a year, and it is now on the market. It is listed for an extremely, extremely reasonable price, well below what they could list it at. So, and it is all, I believe they did all the same finishes in even the market rate and
That's
this
3-bedroom,
unit.
isn't it?
It's
3-bedroom?
a 3-bedroom. So anyhow, it is a fantastic unit if you know anyone in the market at a great price.
All right.
All right, okay, so one caveat to this, in all likelihood, any of these additional changes probably are gonna have to go into the new code. I'm not sure that we're gonna be able to bring this as an isolated piece. We
Sure.
probably need to have a conversation with council about it anyways. And our hope is to really continue focusing on the land use code rewrite to get that to you all
Sure.
eventually as quick as possible.
Makes sense.
But that said, we'll take this back when we review the inclusionary housing side of things and put that in as a discussion item and option for folks, so.
I read recently that Santa Fe is using Clarion as well, and I know that they're trying real hard to put some of the things that we've been doing for years into their land use code. So once again, for the people who don't appreciate all the work we've spent since, 2016, to put these things in place, including the multi-jurisdictional housing authority, that we are so far ahead of so many other places.
Yep.
Doesn't feel that way sometimes, but we are.
We get reached out to by lots of different cities and counties about stuff that we have on the books already, so that's a positive for sure. Do you have the PDF called up by chance, or can you get to it? It's in the planning commission packet, that folder, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up. Okay, so speaking of land use code rewrites, we received the consolidated draft, probably 95% done or so, a few weeks ago. And Matt with Clarion wanted to get it to us because he was going on vacation for a few weeks. And as he said, he didn't have absolutely everything in there, but he wanted to get it to us so we can start reviewing it. We've been going over that, and we put together a few hot topics to talk about tonight out of the new code. Some of which we've been already discussing in the past, but a couple of them also that have come up recently. So I want to go over these. Since it kind of transfers seamlessly, since we were talking about inclusionary housing, there's another issue that's come up, and it is around the option, as you all know, for inclusionary housing. There's a few ways you can satisfy it, right? You can actually build the units. Currently at that 1 out of 6 percentage. You can provide deed restricted units off-site, but instead of 1 out of 6, it's 1 out of 4, like 25% level. Or you can dedicate land within the development, but currently that particular dedication is just at the same percentage, 1 out of 6. The potential challenge there is if a development, let's say it's a 30 unit development, 1 out of 6, you'd be required to do five units. Let's say that the developer dedicates a piece of land to the housing trust. There's not really any guarantee that those units are going to get built within the same time frame as the market rate units, because CHT is very dependent on grants, and they may have other projects going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's entirely possible that, 25 units, 25 market rate units, in that case, would get built and before any of the affordable units. That's if we even allowed it. Or you create a situation where if we did build in the timing requirement, they could get 5 market rate units, and then they got to wait until one of the affordable units gets built, and might cause all sorts of challenges because the financing isn't there or whatever it may be. So we chatted about this, and I want to go to the next slide. So we're proposing that in that case where you're dedicating to the housing trust, to the city or the housing authority, whoever it may be, we kind of slightly increase that percentage. We've got 1 out of 4 if it's being built off-site, but the purpose of inclusionary housing is actually to get the affordable units built on-site. So we're kind of taking the gradient right in between and proposing 1 out of 5. So in other words, in that 30-unit subdivision, then you need to provide 6. So you actually would get an extra unit out of that. And in that case, then we'd probably allow for the affordable unit, or sorry, for the market rate units to just be built at whatever schedule they have, and then CHT builds it whenever they have the ability to do it. So we wouldn't force the timing piece onto that because of the potential challenges with dedication. So, thoughts on this particular?
Clarification, that unit count is based on the density requirements for the lot, is that right?
That unit count is based off of whatever the development number of units proposed is. So I gave the 30 unit, but right here I wrote 25 units, If it's a 25 unit development, then in this case, 1 out of 5 would have to be affordable. So in that case, 5 of them would need to be affordable, deed restricted.
But when they do a land dedication, that land then has to support 5
5
units.
units,
So,
yes.
and that calculation is, I believe, it's like 2,400 square feet per.
Depends on the zoning.
Depending on the zoning, but let's say you're in, R3 or whatever, where it's, I think that's where that comes from, I think. Is it 24 maybe?
Sounds about right.
Something like,
Might be.
28, maybe 24 if it's being satisfied. So
okay.
yes, 24.
Well,
but 24,
let's just
50.
say that's what it is. Then that lot that's dedicated would have to be 5 times that. So it'd be a 12,000 square foot lot. Is that?
Yes, and it would have to also account for all parking,
Back,
access,
building,
all the above.
So what about the density bonuses that developers are allowed? What happens to
That
that?
that actually would be, so yes,
So
if
that
they're
would be part
satisfied.
that would apply to the lot that's being dedicated.
Correct.
So they would be able to build more or the lot would be smaller because of the density bonus?
Well, technically, all the lots get the bonus,
Oh, okay,
right?
okay.
And so they would need to show the proposed number of units.
Okay, I get it.
For the
I
entire
forgot that it
development.
was all of the lots because they were doing that right.
Yeah.
Okay.
How do we know the proposed number of units? I mean, we go back to River Ridge.
Right.
Put in the streets and everything, put up for sale signs, and you have multiple builders. And those builders could build a single-family unit or a triplex.
Yeah, it's a challenge when the developer's not actually proposing the units themselves. The way we did it with River Ridge was you were allowed up to a certain amount of units. And on each, they sort of designated on each of the lots the number of units that was allowed up to. But they were required, if I recall, they were required to provide 8 units, which CHT did, and that was based off of the maximum number of units that were,
That was possible, the maximum
Possible.
density.
yeah.
Now, should we put something like that in the code so that that doesn't have to become
Negotiated.
an issue for every planned development?
River Ridge was not a PD, so
Okay.
we were able to do it through the inclusionary housing agreement in that case. So I'm not, we wouldn't necessarily have to call it out in the code, but it's nice to have those things
Yeah.
there and visible. Yeah, it's worth giving it some thought as far as that language.
So what you're proposing basically is to get, to increase the number of affordable units for these subdivisions from 1 to 6 to 1 to 5, right?
Yeah, for things that are, for lots being dedicated.
Dedicated within the subdivision.
Right,
And still outside of the subdivision would be 1 to 4.
correct.
And if they're dedicated outside of the subdivision, does the subdivision still get the density bonus?
No, it actually says, it says it in the code, it has to be done within the site.
Good, because I wouldn't want that to happen. Okay, good.
Yeah, and Giff, just kind of follow up on your question there too. What we have done in some of these cases when lots have been further subdivided, and the number of inclusionary units have already been established, is we have charged the fee in lieu on those additional units
Okay.
as well. So there is another way of recapture there.
But the nice thing about doing the maximum the way they did at River Ridge is you get units as
Get the
opposed to
most
fee in
units.
lieu.
Most
Yep.
units.
Yep.
Right.
Virtually every time, that's
We like that.
the better of the options, yeah.
How fast is the housing trust building units?
Not as fast as we wish.
Not fast enough.
Seems like you're gonna end up with a lot of lots and a lot of delay on actually building the units.
Well, the Housing Trust does some when it's dedicated to them, right, Greg?
Yeah,
But
there's-
they're not doing all of them, like
No,
Holman
yeah,
Court
some
and
like-
West End
like West End
was yours, but Holman
Built by
Court
the,
was the
no, they were built by the
developer.
developer.
Yeah, that's what I'm
And
saying.
then
So-
like
Right,
M and Third is a housing trust,
right.
yeah.
So it's not a requirement that they go to the Housing Trust. It's just,
Land dedication just goes to the city could
or it can go,
build all those units, like, how much of a boon is it to have more land versus the tight requirement now that you actually
Right.
build the unit?
right. Well, it could go to the Housing
You get
Trust.
one more, but if it takes
I mean, the
5 more
Housing
years to
Authority.
build, because you
Is it
gotta
worth-
line up
yeah,
grant funding,
yeah.
is it really
Yeah.
worth it, or is it gonna have these weird pockets of lots, but no?
Land is valuable.
So
It's very valuable, and there, potentially could lead to additional units down the line, possibly.
We've talked before about land that the city might acquire through this process, and using it to leverage a developer to say, we'll give you the 99-year lease as we do for the Chafee Housing Trust, or we'll just give you the land, but this is what we want you to build. So I guess there's a lot of different ways probably. I don't really know all of them, but I think there's a lot of options. And the Housing Authority could be another one that the land could be dedicated to. And again, if they get their financing, they plan to build, but I don't know if that'll happen.
The intent is to obviously get the units built onto this particular
Right.
parcel, and not use it as a trading chip for something else. But that said, just simply having the land is quite valuable.
Yeah. Well, if you had the land and you put it out for bid, you say, this is what we want. We need apartments that are deed restricted at this level or whatever, but we've got the land as a incentive to make the developer whole.
Yeah, it's playing with an existing code
Right.
option, and just recognizing though that there's a bit of deficiency, if you will, in this dedication option, because it can lead to serious delays and,
that'd be my concern. I like the idea that you're expanding the number of units by doing that.
Hmm.
My concern would just be the timing of when you're gonna get the units built. It seems like a stringent requirement now that they get built along with the other ones.
yeah, and I think in this case, we might want to look at waiving that timing requirement because you don't want to hold up a private development because the nonprofit or the public developer isn't able to meet their portion of it, right?
That's not
I think that would be setting ourselves up for some failure there and certainly some animosity on the part of the private developers.
I also think what you're referring to might be more of an issue of accountability outside of the scope of this. Like, there's not just, there's multiple options for, am I correct in that assumption that there's multiple options for land dedication? So you don't have to dedicate to CHT.
Right.
Yeah, it can go to the
Right.
city, it can go to the housing
Housing
authority.
authority.
Yeah, so
It
if,
could in fact go to Habitat for Humanity.
right, like, there may be,
Other options.
there may be options that, like, 2 years down the road, if it's a
Right.
trend and you're like, well, this,
Right.
I don't know, that might be outside of the scope of.
Well, if it stays within the development, usually, and it's not dedicated anywhere, the developer develops. And we've seen that quite a number of times. And that's what's happening, I think, over on Oak Street with the Dieselin project, 505, that they're building all of it. They're building a whole building full of rentals that are deed restricted, and I think 2 of the townhouses are deed restricted. So, there's all kinds of ways to do it. We're just talking about if, like at River Ridge, if the developer is not a builder, they're just developing, and then they're going to sell off the lots, then it becomes more practical for them to dedicate the lot, to give the lot to one of the entities. Does that make sense?
I guess I see the situation, I'm a developer.
Right.
9 times out of 10, I'm just gonna give you the lots.
Right, that's what I'm saying. But if you're a builder and you're building on the lots, like
And I think
Dieselin
9
is.
times out of 10, I'm still just gonna give you the lots and sink the cost into building these things that I
Right.
lose money on.
Well, and I think that's where the incentive
Right.
of the 1 out of 5, that,
Right.
like, I think what
Yeah.
Bill's saying is, like, if that's the trend, we're gonna increase the
Right.
requirement,
Right,
I
right,
like that part for sure.
Yeah, and you're gonna be giving more land,
right,
which means you can
Yeah.
build fewer market rate units or at least smaller lots.
right.
Does the decision rest with the developer or with the city about
The
which?
developer.
The developer gets the full
Yep.
decision, I'll do this,
Right.
this, or that.
Yep.
Well, and we've talked about the builders who are building. They can build, they can afford to build the deed restricted units because they're also building the market rate units, and so their profit percentages for the market rate pays for the deed restricted units in theory. Whether it does all the time, I don't know, but that's the conversation that we've had.
Right, but if you don't have to build those, then you don't have to offset that cost.
That's true, but you still have to give up a land parcel that's pretty valuable.
And which,
Yeah. So I don't know, it's up to them, yeah.
We do have an example in Southside, which was before we had the IH ordinance. So it was just crafted for the subdivision, or at least the current iteration of IH. And in there, they set aside 2 lots for triplexes, and the condition that's put on them is those are going to be the IH units, all 6 of those, and that permits for those have to be pulled within 5 years of the first permit being pulled on the subdivision. Now, that's, we could look at doing something like that and even tightening that up a little as far as permits versus COs and all that. But that's one example out there where there is a broad timeline, so it doesn't just go on forever and not
Some
get
mechanism
developed.
to-
And so at that point, we would stop issuing market rate permits if we got to that 5 years.
how does, on the land dedication, how does the viability of that land get determined? As far, if they're like, I want to give you half old landfill, half swamp, obviously.
So in the last, not the last IH code update, but the one before that, we actually put provisions in the inclusionary housing ordinance about the type of
About
land
the type of
for being, that it had to be
So every lot.
developable.
You got the swamp. Okay, I think we like it,
Yeah,
yep,
Okay, all right.
I'm hearing.
Okay, moving on from inclusionary housing. Now we get into some real fun stuff.
Oh, boy.
So, riparian buffers, we have talked about this quite a bit before. When the first iteration, the draft installment, came out with language from Clarion that they had recommended, we heard from a lot of people about the language, and about the language being way too restrictive. So
I got cornered like in bars, like,
you and me both.
oh yeah.
So this map here, what it shows, the orange is actually a slightly older version of the 100-year floodplain that's shown here. And the reason I brought it up is, floodplain is not the riparian area, but I will say there are a lot of similarities between the extents of the floodplain and the extents of the riparian area along the main stem of the Arc and along the South Arc River. The main thing that changed here, and this is not updated, is that Two Rivers South Side went through a LOMR process to have the floodplain moved. But the old one is shown there where Two Rivers South Side is. What this map does show, though, is the distinction, really, of the riparian area along the Arc versus the riparian area along the South Arc. It's the main stem of the Arc through the vast majority of city limits is considerably steeper slopes than along the South Arc. Now, granted, there's some variation in both of them, but generally speaking, the South Arc is much flatter. Your banks are much, much shorter than what is out at the main stem of the Arc. Next slide, please. Again, just kind of getting back to the whys of this, this group, has been pushing for this for a while because of development happening right along the river, especially along the main stem of the Arc. The one on the left is a little dark, but that's those condos that are right along the river just to the east of this building. And then the ones on the right are just to the west, northwest of us. And, this photo shows where the one house that's going in right now, it tore up a bunch of trees that were right there along the banks. So the purpose is to provide some protection along our rivers and streams and such. Because, I keep saying this to folks, but if you're standing on the bridge and you're looking northwards, that iconic view with, Mount Princeton in the background and all the cottonwoods and everything else, technically, all those cottonwoods could be torn down today, right? And there's virtually nothing because most of those cottonwoods are not within the designated floodplain. So you wouldn't even have to go through a floodplain development permit. So that gets to the why are we doing this at all. Next slide. So I'll read it to you. It's, but the language that Clarion had provided, which became a little bit controversial, says that in the riparian buffer, a 25-foot riparian buffer shall be provided that extends landward of the ordinary high water mark or top of bank, whichever provides the greatest amount of protected area as determined by the director from any river, stream, or creek. And furthermore, it goes on to say, no building, structure, or land use may be established, expanded, or enlarged within the riparian buffer. And Clarion themselves made a little note down at the bottom, a footnote saying, further discussion is needed about other small encroachments that may be allowed, such as stairs, patios, pathways, and fire pits, should these be allowed to encroach into the buffer. So this is the piece that people really freaked out about. And I would say it specifically had to do with the language about top of bank in most cases, because top of bank can be a somewhat subjective concept. High water, ordinary high water is much more delineable. Surveyor can go out there and tell you, what the natural pattern is for the general high water mark. Whereas top of bank, well, let's go to the next slide and I'll explain it a little bit more. Boy, that got big. Okay. Well, I put this photo in just to show, like, yeah, in the main stem of the arc, you've got a little bit more delineated banks and your more narrow section of riparian area. Maybe because, once you get up to the top of that bank, it dries out considerably, so it can't really sustain riparian vegetation, or it's been grazed in the past or mowed or whatever other activities. Next slide. Okay. So I made this little graphic to try to make things a little bit easier to understand. If this is the main stem of the Arkansas River, what we have here, the blue just kind of shows your typical water flow, right? The dashed line is your ordinary high water mark, which can be delineated fairly easily. The green is where your typical riparian area exists. It goes basically right up to the most noticeable top of bank and maybe a tad bit beyond it. Beyond that, generally riparian vegetation can't really sustain because of how much higher above the water table it is in a lot of these areas. Granted, there's some variation, but that's pretty typical. On the left, you've got, again, using the existing language, you can see if you went to top of bank and went 25 feet back, you're getting, basically, you're not really protecting any riparian area or very little of it. You're protecting area that's not riparian that could be developed upon. And since most of the properties go to the center of the waterway, you're talking about a no-build area that is a minimum of 75 feet over, in this particular example, which can make it very challenging to develop if you have property along the river, and is questionable whether or not that'd be considered takings. On the right shows the true challenge of using that top of bank terminology. Which top of bank? How do you know it's the top of bank, right? At one point, there was a channel or the water extended all the way up to that, the highest point on the right-hand side. Is that the top of bank, or is the first one the top of bank? So if you're using top of bank, number one, you're already excluding the entire riparian area and adding a protection zone beyond that, which in the arc, along the main arc, you're not really protecting any riparian vegetation in that case. And if you're going to the second top of bank, you're talking about possible protection area of hundreds of feet. So this is what people got really worked up about, was that top of bank terminology and calculation. So by simply, let's go to the next slide. By changing things up in that language, and we say, we make a distinction between the Arkansas River and the South Ark River, and we say instead, along the main stem of the arc, a 25-foot riparian buffer shall be provided that extends landward of the ordinary high water mark as determined by a licensed surveyor from any river, stream, or creek. So in this case, you're finding that ordinary high water mark, and you are taking a horizontal line to determine where the edge of that buffer is. I would say in 95% of cases, if not more, 25 feet in a horizontal line along the main stem of the arc from ordinary high water is going to include all of the riparian vegetation that's out there. In a lot of cases, it's so steep and it only goes to the top of the bank, that riparian vegetation is only 10 feet wide or 15 feet wide. So we're still, by and large, protecting what we're intending to protect without taking the majority of the developable area away from property owners in this case.
So that rings true to like my common sense part of my brain, but it has like a wetlands person or whatever, riparian biologist kind of have the same thought, like, or someone who knows that kind of thing?
We've passed it by, a few folks in the community that deal with this, and they absolutely 100% recognize a difference between the main stem of the arc, the topography, the vegetation, and the south arc. Beyond that, I can't say we've gotten a true consultation on it.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little bit of common sense that we're trying to apply to it. So, just to be frank. I'll throw this out there, and then let's go through the South Arc example, so then we can come back to any conversation. Go to the next slide, please. So the South Arc is obviously different. There's very few areas where there's a significant bank rising up from the river itself. It tends to be much more gradual, though there are a few places. So this is an example. This was taken from basically the pedestrian bridge going over to Vanderveer, looking downwards. It floods out, every year, dozens of feet out of the banks. Next slide. So on the left, you have an example of the fact that the riparian edge extends much further than it does in the main stem of the arc, going back to that initial map and how wide the floodplain is and everything else. In some cases, it's 150 feet, maybe even 200 feet from the river's edge, where the riparian vegetation is. What we're proposing here is a compromise between trying to protect as much of the riparian vegetation that we can, while still acknowledging that we live in an urban landscape, that we don't want to create a takings issue or reduce the overall developability of people's land that is along the river. And so we're basically proposing a doubling of that buffer area to 50 feet from ordinary high water. Again, that's something that can be delineated fairly easily. You get twice as much of the protection. And then in both cases, we're considering, and we haven't really fleshed this out yet, but we are considering some potential additional language somewhere, don't quote me yet, but like something along the lines of, for the 25 feet beyond the buffer, so in this case, from 50 to 75 feet from ordinary high water, you'd need to get a tree removal permit for doing up to 50% of the trees, removing 50% of the trees in that area. So it'd be kind of a de facto buffer area in some way to provide potentially a little bit more protection for the vegetation out there. It's something just we're playing around with, thinking through. On the right-hand side, what that shows is the few areas where there are actually banks. If you think about the Pharisee Boys, automotive dealership, there's actually a very significant bank that's somewhat comparable to the main stem of the arc that comes up straight there. Is probably a 15 or 20 foot rise in that location. So you can see how if you measure it from the ordinary high water mark, you would go back 50 feet. In that case, you're not really protecting all that much riparian area in that 50 feet. One of the options would be I'll have to get up to kind of show you. So this ends up being a little bit more restrictive to folks. Ooh, we got dizzy for a second. So in this particular case, you could do the measurement from here, but if that ends up being way too restrictive because you're taking up too much of this lot, a lot of our lots are 125, 150 feet deep. In this case, you're talking about from here to here is almost 75 feet already. So you're taking up half the lot. Another way to potentially measure this is to measure it, anything that is over a certain rise of a run, a certain steepness, you can measure the 50 feet here first. So say this is 20. and then 30 feet here. You're still measuring the 50 feet, you have the same buffer, but it's just measured a little bit differently. It's, the county actually is already proposing an alternate measurement along those lines as well, and that's kind of where the idea had come from, to do it that way.
Where is the 100-year floodplain?
Well, it's back to that, could you go back to that first map? Yep, right there. So it's everything in the orange,
Okay.
with the exception of this. This is the area that got taken out through the loanwork process.
And when
it
you,
varies considerably, like, in some places along the South Arc, it's right at the banks. In some places, it's hundreds of feet wide.
well, we've already identified in the South Arc area, the old Vanderveer areas that won't be developable,
Correct.
right?
Right. This is really more about the private properties along that
Okay.
stretch within
Okay.
the city. So we're trying to, again, find that compromise.
I have some concerns about, if you go in that first slide on the first main stem, that little graphic you have. So it would be from the high water mark, 25 feet just basically would go up to the top of bank. And, there's erosion that we have to consider along that area. And I understand that there's been pushback, but I don't think we want to have people developing things right up to the rear setback allowance on the bank, on the top of the bank. I guess I would favor having more of a buffer, even if it's not typically riparian.
Yeah, what if you had something like, if the slope of the bank is more than X, you need to be N feet behind that bank. Because,
The same thing with the
look what goes on and, and obviously it's not as extreme in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Houses fall into the sea because of erosion. And to Francie's point, if you could build right up to that green and you get significant erosion, what happens to that house?
Plus you have a view issue. You've got things built right up, just like we do now in the middle of town. So what if the buffer was increased and you allowed things like fire pits, patios, to Clarion's thing, in that buffer area, but not development per se? So that you'd still allow people use of that space with the tree issues, but not build things there because of, the view, the erosion, the land is changing. Look at what the river did this summer. I've been here enough years now to have seen it go higher than it did this summer, to the point where you couldn't get anything under the bridge. So, climate is changing, and I think we have to take that into consideration. It's not all about what can be built or developed. We have to protect, we won't get any more land around our river. This is all we've got. If we don't do something to make sure that we're taking care of it, we're not going to be happy with ourselves.
Yeah, I guess I kind of echo that, and that was why I asked the question. We don't need to study this to death, but there's a difference between kind of common sense from those of us that are lay persons and actual scientists looking at, or a geologist or someone, I don't know. But I get what you're saying. 25 feet kind of makes sense if I'm walking on this river trail. But I don't know, it doesn't really go further than makes sense to me, and I'm a little uncomfortable with that.
I totally hear it. The thing that we're hearing the most from folks with this, it was mostly related to the top of bank, right? Because as soon as you measure it from top of bank, suddenly your buffer is a lot bigger. But folks want us to remember that the depth of their lots are only so great. And so the further away that you get from the rear lot line, which in this, most cases is the middle of the river, then you got front setbacks to deal with and everything else. So just to take an easy example right here along Sackett, if there was a 25-foot setback from the top of bank up here, you're left with an incredibly small footprint for developability.
Well, I understand the difference between measuring from the watermark and which the watermark could change, but I guess we'll have to just deal with that. I understand that that's an issue, but I'm not sure that 25 feet from the high water mark is enough to satisfy my tree-loving heart.
Well, looking at the pictures that you showed of those condos, they go right down to that
Oh, yeah.
path.
Oh,
Yeah, they're in the green.
Right.
Yes, they're definitely in the green, and they've used the entire bank, tore
Right.
the entire bank down, and that path floods. It floods even when it's not high water. And that is ridiculous, because there's runoff from their driveways, from their housing.
We don't have any rules right now, so they're perfectly in their rights to build.
That's right.
a wall.
Correct. They needed to get floodplain development permits to show no significant rise, but there's no protection there. And I actually did go and measure this, because your ordinary high water is actually just a little bit over the path right there,
Yeah,
right?
it's over the
Right.
path.
So I actually went and measured it out 25 feet from there, for instance. And in that case, it puts it back, I don't know if you can see it on that beige house, there's like a line
Yeah.
halfway back, almost to the left of the picture.
Yeah.
The post
Keep,
for the.
keep going, yeah,
Oh, dang.
keep
Okay.
going left.
It's, yeah.
Right there, yep.
Oh.
So that would be the 25 feet right there. So under the 25-foot buffer, nothing could be built
All
Closer
those
to-
lots on those rivers, basically.
closer to the water than
Right.
that.
But look at that, lot's just been destroyed.
It's been destroyed, the whole thing was.
The whole thing.
Sad day when that happened.
Yeah.
No names mentioned.
I mean, I don't have a river lot, but I tend to lean towards the side of, I think I'm kind of on the other side of this conversation personally. Mostly because I think of things like, well, one, I think there's been a lot of dense lots approved, River Ridge, for example, a lot of, two rivers where subdivisions were approved with building envelopes that didn't take this into account. That's one concern I have. I mean, I think that is in line with what you're talking about on Sackett, where, if we go too far back, there's no buildable lot.
Good.
Also, you look upstream from F Street Bridge, the most iconic view in Salida, and the most people love it. I mean, all of that is built within this riparian zone. I think it was maybe done a little more prudently.
Not true. A lot of those houses are set along Sackett.
Yeah, but in this picture, is the travesty the house, or is it the concrete path?
The travesty is the
Like-
proximity of the house to the river
Yeah, look how close
and the
it is.
path.
And what, I'll agree with you that a lot of the Sackett are within that. Are we going to allow it on the other side of the river too?
That's actually what I was thinking too.
Right.
There's kind of two different situations, particularly in the central section of the main stem. But I mean, I don't know, stepping way out, do we want this to be like an urban canyon along the river? Probably not. Do we think it's really gonna be a wild wilderness
No.
preserve? No, but
I just think there's a middle ground.
Totally.
And I worry that the restrictions are, the other side of the river is the perfect example where this would come into play a lot is, there was, that entire riverbank was for sale a couple years ago.
I know. Well, maybe what a rule like this would do is stop having narrow lots. And you're going to have a deeper lot.
Which
I guess you could turn around and.
I can see your point. I kind of agree with Kenny on this, especially with existing lots.
Yeah.
That have, all of a sudden, somebody bought a lot thinking they can do one thing, and then to kind of move the goalposts on them
Well, that's where a variance comes in,
seems, yeah.
Mr.
And like what he said, if 25 feet is, I mean, that's pretty significant. And
Well, yeah,
I think there's room to move it with, you know, some complicated geometry or something with that, with the steeper bank but, and I agree, the ones on the, you know, those ones right down to the river, yeah. And in downtown, it's, you know,
Well, and
it's not perfect,
so
but-
let me just say, if it was 25 feet from the high water mark, as you said, Bill, and we know where that put it. If that scenario existed with this development, how close to the top of bank could that property be built?
Pretty much right at the top of bank.
Which is my point, is I think if we allow that to be top of, I mean, I think maybe, 25 feet from the high water mark plus X feet from the top of bank, it doesn't have to be huge, but just something so that things aren't
The whole
built.
top of bank thing is where you get into trouble.
Yeah, it changes.
Yeah, well, maybe just adding to the 25 then, I don't know, I worry that, because we've seen it before, that things are, whatever rule comes into play with the land use code, with the riparian corridor, people are gonna take full advantage of whatever little loophole we provide. And we have to be really careful, because that's happened before,
Yeah,
over and over.
picking up on that, I guess I was thinking I'd almost rather be more aggressive now, knowing that eventually development will probably come across the river, I guess, if the railroad decides to do its
Yeah.
thing. And then maybe write in some exceptions. If you have an existing lot that's
Right.
narrow, you get
Right.
some more allowance or something.
Yeah.
I get it. If you have a
Right, I do
street that's
too.
not gonna move and a lot that's been around for 100 years, like, we're not gonna change that, and they deserve to build in some
Oh,
fashion.
who knows? The city decided it could go and put concrete in the middle of the river. So, the city has messed with the riparian corridor to beat the band. So it's a little disingenuous for us as people in the city to sit and say private developers can't do this when the city decides it can.
Well, the rules would apply to the city as well.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Oh, no, if you read it, I think there's something in there that says the city doing things like it did is exempt from these rules.
Is that right, Bill?
Yeah, there's things like fishing access and things like that, which are not subject to these rules.
Well, that's different, though.
It's not a
That the
structure.
fishing, yeah, it's not a structure, it's not a built thing.
Well, and I
that's
don't
just
know,
an-
I can't remember if there's specific exceptions for that. It wouldn't shock me, right? Because the river park has been around and
Right.
manipulated the river for decades and
Well, look at the
decades.
Scout Wave.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I mean, things have been, well, actually, the entire channel, what I understand, the entire channel was actually moved quite a bit by the railroad.
Right.
A century plus ago as well, so.
Well, we can't control
been
what was done in the
manipulated by-
past, but we can sure put things in place to protect what happens in the future.
Right.
That's all I'm saying, is I think we need to be really thoughtful and responsible about protecting what we have left. And if there's somebody that has a building lot that they've had forever and they can't build a reasonable house or whatever because of these restrictions, then we hear it as a variance. I'm not afraid to take my time to do that.
Yeah, the other thing is how much money the river brings into the city.
Right.
The rafting, I read somewhere, it was an enormous sum they made with the rafting this year, the fishing, that draws people to Salida. And if all they get to look at is that, it's not very, it doesn't
Just have a
feel.
responsibility And it's not our decision, we're just advising and giving you our opinions. It will be your decision and council's ultimately. But I do think we have to take all of
It's a
this
team
really
effort.
seriously. Pardon?
It's a team effort.
A team,
I mean,
well, sure, and I appreciate that you brought this to us and you're listening to our feedback, but I do feel pretty strongly that we need to be responsible for the future and not just say, well, just because it's happened in the past, we need to let it continue to happen. You know, what can we do to protect what we still have left? And that's what my heart says.
Yeah. Well, and just to kind of give you all a sense of like what the plans are, you know, we wanted to get this feedback, maybe to help craft any of our recommendations, but then one of the next steps is to bring it back to the Land Use Code Advisory Committee. And so we can report back some of, you know, the discussion that we're having here today. That will probably become the next draft, I guess, which would then go in front of the public at some point, and then we got to get the public feedback on things
Right.
before it ever comes back to Planning Commission for potential approvals.
Right.
Or recommendations, I should say.
And I just want to say that no matter what happens, there'll be people screaming.
Yep.
That just is human nature. We're going to hear screaming no matter what. So we just have to decide what we really want and stand up. You know, I mean, it's, if people don't like it, but it's the right thing to do for our river and our city, then that's our obligation.
We have some potential language, as I was mentioning, around, you know, the maybe around tree permits, you know, within the buffer, around grading permits as well, to ensure that we don't get that erosion, because we do see a lot of that today. You're not really required to do a grading permit, even if you're right on the banks, as long as you go through your floodplain development permit and show that you're not developing within the floodway or not creating a significant rise. So we have some ideas about proposing that, just to protect from the erosion. And then I do want to, though, just get your quick hits on the idea of any potential provisions for these small encroachments that Clarion mentions, you know, stairs, patios, pathways, fire pits, et cetera.
You know, stairs create more erosion because so we dealt with that at River Ridge and said you can't do that. I think
It's being done.
it's being done.
It
but-
can't be done in the floodway.
Okay,
It can today be done as long as it's not in the floodway, or even if it's in the floodway and it doesn't show
right.
a significant.
Well, I'd like to say no to that, but I think having, you know, little decks or patios or whatever, I mean, I think that, you know, that's a compromise. But, you know, once you have people start going off the edge, you know, then you're creating more of a problem, and you're putting, again, is that okay to have a gazebo there right on the edge? Is that what we want? Or is it just flat, which would be okay in my mind, is like a paver
Yeah, I think the concept
situation.
here is anything would be basically
flat.
under 4 feet.
Right. So that might be a good compromise to make, to say, you know, we're going to protect a little more, but we're going to allow these things.
Anybody else have some thoughts about it?
I mean, I would be inclined to just, to not restrict the lesser items. Like,
Patio.
I don't see it as a big problem now, and I
Right.
mean, I don't see it being a huge issue.
It's the
if people wanna
stairs
enjoy
going
the-
down that
Well, you
bother
can
me.
still get
Yeah.
a permit for that, and it's engineered
Yeah,
to do so. And, yeah, they're engineered for the drainage
that
and,
goes into the riparian area in a lot of cases, and I don't want to have that in the riparian area is what I'm saying. I don't think they should be allowed to build stairs into the riparian area that we're trying to protect.
if I own a lot on the river, I want to walk down to the river.
Yeah, if they're allowed, if we say they can put, you know, a stone patio down there, I guess you would
You want
probably
some
want to have
access,
stairs, otherwise you're gonna have more erosion if they're
But is that in
getting
the-
down, up and down without stairs.
But is that in
You're going to
the,
tell people they can't access
well,
the
no, but
river
is
on
that,
their lot that they
no, but is
own?
that no, I'm not saying you can't access it, but, you know, if we're talking
Yes,
about
you are.
protecting the riparian area, if these things are in the riparian area, are we protecting it?
What if there was a cap on the amount of square footage, for instance, that, You could have, up to 200 square feet, just throw a number out there, for fire pit, patio within the buffer, and a stairwell to access it, of certain width or whatever it may
Yeah,
be.
it's a slippery slope, but I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, 200 square feet.
But it is your property, and it's hard to tell people that they can't access their property. You can tell them what they can do on it, but to
Right.
say you can't get there,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
It's tricky.
Tricky.
Tricky. All right, we've got one other item. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and energy levels and see if everybody wants to jump into it. It could be easy. It could be not. We could start the conversation and continue it. We could stop right now and bring it back at another work session. It's something you're all should be familiar with because it's been brought up a couple times in presentations with Clarion around minimum densities / maximum lot size, because the two go hand in hand. How's everybody feeling about jumping into this?
I say let's go over it, but
See what happens.
let's limit the
Okay.
discussion maybe.
I
think
move
it's-
that we put a limit that we get out of here before 8:30.
There you go.
Everybody,
Second.
Yeah,
everybody cool with that?
yeah.
All right,
Okay.
good. Okay, so the topic of minimum densities / maximum lot sizes has come up and is proposed in the current draft consolidated code. And the question of why, right? Well, basically, it's because you see all those parcels out there that basically are not black, don't show up as black, in this particular slide. Technically, any one of those parcels, somebody could come in today and plop a single 5,000 square foot house into the middle of it and call it good, right? Not exactly the most efficient use of our urban land, number one. Two, certainly not the most efficient use of our services, our water lines, our sewer, and all the maintenance that goes with that, right? If we're trying to grow wisely, you want to have some level of density to ensure that you do not have to further spread those water and sewer lines and roads and everything else out into the county, out in the countryside. So the concept of minimum densities, maximum lot sizes is something that communities across the country are starting to use with a little bit more frequency. It's not super common, but it establishes an expectation of that if you're going to develop within city limits, that you need to do it with a certain level of efficiency. So going on to the next slide. So what was proposed, and the last time you saw it was, and I apologize for this being kind of small, maybe could you zoom just a tiny bit? And I don't care if we lose everything from the MD over. We really want to focus on this. Maybe just slide a little bit to the left. Yeah, right there. That's great. Great. So this is what was proposed most recently, right? You've got your minimum lot sizes. So that in a way, this is kind of your maximum density. It's the minimum lot size or your maximum density. Those are established. And for the most part, that maximum density is pretty much the same in R1 and R2 as it is today. The biggest changes are in R3 and R4, and to an extent in along the highway, the MH. So the maximum density allowed has gone up by a factor of probably 1.5 in those other zones. The new thing is that bottom line, this minimum density, which takes into account the maximum size of a lot that you can have only one unit on, right? Now, of course, there's allowances for existing. So if you have a really big lot and one unit on it today, and that land use code gets approved and goes into effect, nobody's gonna make you build a unit. But when you come in to develop or redevelop it, you need to meet the minimum densities. So what was proposed here, R1, and this was based off of an analysis of the size of existing lots, both vacant and developed within the city today in each of the zone districts. And based off of like the number of units of various sizes, we came up with these initial minimum density figures that it would, in R1, you could only have, you could have a 22,500 square foot lot and have one, but as soon as you're 22,501 and you come in to redevelop it or develop it for the first time, that means you need to have two, right? Same thing for R2, you have a lot that's 11,250, you can have one unit. If it's 11,251, you need to do two units. Well, we had a project come to us conceptually recently that magnified some of the challenges to this. And those challenges are financial, primarily. You have let's say a 12,000 square foot lot in the R2, and it's a vacant lot, and you're required to build two units. I mean, we talked about it earlier, with the challenges of financing just one unit. If you're required to finance two, you may not be able to do it, may not be able to develop it at all as a private owner. So, can you go to the next slide? What we did is we looked at what could be done to still provide some minimum densities, but give people an option where instead of actually having to build those, say, two units in R2, which they may never get financing for, it would allow them to subdivide their lot, keep that same minimum amount of 11,250 for one parcel, but then have another, if they wanted it that big, and then have another parcel that was at least equal to the minimum lot size that's allowable in that zone district. So if you look at R2, what we basically did is we took that 11,250 and added the minimum lot size, 5,625, to come up with a 16,875 square foot threshold. So it provides them that option to at least subdivide the lot and sell one of them, which will eventually become a unit, right? And keep that base amount of 11,250. And could you go to the next slide? A graphical representation of what I just said. Might need to zoom out just a tad.
I thought we lowered the minimum lot size in R2. I thought 5625 or whatever is what it is now, and we decided we were going to take it down to a lower number.
We lowered the incentive, not the base. So the inclusionary housing incentive did come down.
But not the lot
base.
size for the new, okay.
Right. And if it does, let's say that number does come down, we can adjust accordingly. But this is a graphical representation
Yeah.
of that scenario. And to put a finer point on it, I went back to that analysis of the number of units at various sizes. There's like almost over 200 lots that fall between 11,250 square feet and 17,000 square feet
In R2?
in R2.
Huh,
There's a lot. So,
so to speak.
yes, there's
See how I
many.
did there?
And so we don't want to set ourselves up for failure where, and I don't know how many of those are vacant versus developed.
Right.
We didn't boil down to that, but we want to avoid creating this scenario where suddenly people can't meet the minimum densities, right? Because the financing problem or whatever it may be. But anyways, this would allow folks, if we went up to that 16,875 in R2, for them to split off a reasonably sized lot that could be sold and built a unit on it, and maybe even two, potentially. 2 condos, for instance.
So anything below 16,875, they could still do one?
Yes, yep. Under this scenario. But they could also split the lot up any way they want to, and,
Right.
you know, that's still an option. But you've got a lot of those lots where the house may be centered, there might be an existing
Right, centered.
house, and it's right in the middle
Right,
It's like yours,
as well.
right?
You, Giff?
yeah.
And so this would allow for still to split off a piece of it in most cases, not necessarily every single case, but, anyways, it's an adjustment that we're talking about making because we realize we might have inadvertently, created a situation we just didn't want to get into.
Didn't you talk about too, something where on a, like R1, I think it was, or that something that was built had to be at least X square feet?
The unit, you mean, or the?
Yeah, that somebody couldn't build like a tiny little house on a great big lot? Wasn't there something in there that we talked about? No?
Not that I recall.
So.
No, I guess I dreamed
remember.
it, yeah.
I mean, were you talking about ADUs or?
No, it was
the primary?
just to prevent people from underdeveloping.
I can't remember that.
I may not be remembering right. Yeah.
Anyways, this was, wanted to bring this to y'all's attention and see if you had any, specific feedback about it. Obviously, it would have, could you go back to the one that's redlined? It's extrapolated over the other zone districts. So we take that initial minimum density and add that minimum lot size to it to come up with a new minimum density. And it's most applicable in the R1 through MN zones. MC, that's actually an error. That one is a 0 lot minimum.
Bill, I'm looking at this and if I don't know the backstory of why this is done, and I look at this table, I mean, basically ultimately we just increased our density minimum, right? So I understand this. I think it makes total sense for the scenario you're talking about where, you want to find that flexibility, but I mean, this, like R2 going up to 16,000, R3 going up to 8,000, we're expanding the ability to have less dense developments then? I mean, this would apply to all developments, right?
Right.
Yes, so you're saying with this change is
Yeah, I mean,
expanding
the broader impact, is there a broader impact where a developer comes in and says, I want to do, in R3, I want to do 8,000 square foot lots across the board. And, the intended
Right.
consequence was to help this homeowner, but, instead we get 10 acres at 8,000 versus 5. I mean, to me, that's the bigger
Yeah.
question.
It's always a possibility that they go that route, but
And they will.
Well,
I don't know,
It
because
seems
the-
like our developments are trending towards pretty.
Yeah, because you need the number of
you know.
units to,
So I don't think
Yeah.
it's,
Right.
I don't,
yeah, because, I think most people would want to zone to R3 for some of those higher density developments, right? Condos or whatever it may be, or rental apartments. Yes, there'll be some who want to do single family.
But in R2, you can't do a lot of those
because remember, you're
things.
talking about density, not lot size as well, right? So.
I mean, in R2, you can't go in and do without a special permit. It's what, a duplex, a single family, or then if you split it out, that's 2. but.
You can do
Triplex, you know,
multifamily as
but-
well, but it's much more limited
Right.
on the density.
So you've got a very big, I don't know, I'm hearing what Kenny said, I think that's a good
What
point.
if you, I mean, I don't know if this is legal to do, but could you say for undeveloped lots? I mean, for developed lots, you can do this. So, but if someone, to Kenny's point, has a 10-acre parcel, you know, even in R2, you know, can they split that into 17,000 square foot lots? And I would hope the answer would be no.
No, because we're not talking, they would still have the lot size still has to be 5625, right? You're talking,
Minimum lot size.
Minimum,
or minimum.
right.
Yeah. Okay, so you can do
Maximum.
8,000.
Yeah,
Yeah, you could do technically, almost 17,000, like Gift talks about, but would they? I mean, we don't have any minimum density requirements today, right? Absolutely none. And even with that, we're seeing lots, in the R2 going down to the minimum in some cases, but, other cases 7,500 or whatever it may be. In R3, even smaller. So it's a ceiling, it's a suggested ceiling. It's certainly not a,
it's-
recommended floor. by
Yeah, it's
any
more
means.
flexible. I tend to think it's fine. I'm not sure how much we need to be concerned about that density minimum.
Yeah,
I mean, it's there for a reason, but the trend currently is definitely, in my opinion, towards the other side of the chart, which is the lot size minimums.
sure.
But,
These changes are definitely not oriented towards developers. These changes are really oriented towards the single lot owners who, if they decide to go ahead and develop, shouldn't necessarily be required to provide more units than,
But at 11,250, they could split that lot and make two of the 5625.
but they can't, I
And
think.
sell
that
off one, like you're saying, I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say is that you're trying to increase this to satisfy one issue.
yeah, but under that scenario, if they did have to split it in half,
Right.
let's say it's a 12,000 square foot.
Right.
Then their only choice is to split it in half and create fairly small lots for,
Versus one bigger and one small.
right.
Yeah.
So it gives them a little bit more flexibility. And obviously, if there is already a built unit on the property, that may preclude splitting it in half.
But wouldn't, and I hear you, wouldn't splitting 11,250 or 12,000 or whatever and having the two smaller lots create more density?
Yeah, but.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean,
But maybe.
Isn't that what we're trying to do?
Or,
I just think we're looking for a range of options. So we're not forcing people into that minimum lot size. We're giving them a little flexibility, given that right now there's no ceiling. So like looking at our first iteration is, okay, the ceiling's here. Could the ceiling be here? Maybe, but our first foray into this and just knowing kind of the questions that people come in with, and that does forcing people into two lots of 5625 really meet the purposes of the R2, as opposed to letting people have an 8,000 or 9,000 square foot lot in R2. And I guess to one other point, should a developer, if market realities change and people are looking for bigger lots to build bigger homes on, and so they have a large parcel and they want to zone it or they want to subdivide it into these maximum lot sizes, I think at that time, that's when going through the subdivision plat process, like a major subdivision, which would come both through planning commission and city council, or even a minor, would there's still other criteria. Are you meeting the purpose of the zone district? And if that's what you were doing, I think there's plenty of ways you could say, no, you're not. We've tightened up a lot of those aspects of the code and the review criteria to be able to say that.
It's a huge change from the code today, which would allow you an acre lot in R2.
Right.
Right? So it's a bit of a graduated approach at trying to create the density and giving, to Catherine's points, giving some options
That
without
makes
having to
sense.
force them into the minimum.
Well, I have to trust you guys to know that that's what we need to do.
There's a lot of situations too where, let's say up on the mesa, for instance, where you don't have the opportunity to have like alley lots or alleys in the back. It would be pretty weird if you had to go down that small, because you'd end up with these incredibly skinny
Right.
lots
Right.
as well. So maybe we can bring back some examples of that, or even as we have some subdivisions come in that you all review, we look at it through the lens of.
Right.
I think that would be helpful.
That would be really helpful.
Can this
Yeah.
be sent to us?
Sure, yeah, we can send the whole.
I need to think about this.
Yeah, I agree, Dan.
Do some examples on paper.
Silly.
Right.
Totally.
We're up in the middle of the night and can't sleep. We want something to
I was
do,
up at
right,
3:30
Dan?
thinking
Well,
about it.
thank you for everything tonight and getting through all that. It's a lot to
It was
think
a
about.
really good discussion. Thanks for all your hard work.
And the candy.
And the candy. Thanks to the finance department for the candy.
Nobody goes home until these are
These are
gone.
gone, right?
Figure out these minimum lot standards or eat candy.
I'm gonna give it all to your kids if you don't do something.
That's the real threat right there.
It's just turning apocalypse.
Okay. All right. Off we go. I guess we don't have to move to adjourn or anything in work session.
No.
Just go. We
We'll let you know about the next
Yeah,
meeting here soon. We gotta figure out a couple things,
okay.
so.
No, I lost my cap on your foot.
I gotta ask Bill something.